Today we're going to talk about one of the great stories in the Gospels where Jesus is at a dinner party in his honor at the home of a Pharisee, and a prostitute crashes the party. And in that story we're going to learn something about ourselves and something about God. So in Luke chapter 7, we find this wonderful story of Jesus being invited to a dinner party at the home of one of the Pharisees, a man named Simon. And as he is eating there was probably 20 others who were reclining around the table. The town prostitute walks in. And if you were to see her, she was undoubtedly terrified. I mean, can you imagine the courage for a prostitute to walk into a dinner party of all men, most of them highly, deeply religious people, leaders in the community, and of course the rabbis of the community, and there's Jesus. But in she walks into this room, and I imagine her shaking as she's got a hold of a little flask, and in that flask, an alabaster flask, is kept precious ointment, oil that's scented, made of nard. It's worth a year's wages, and she walks in carrying this, looking for Jesus. She's heard that Jesus is there. She goes to where Jesus is reclining at the table, stands at his feet, and she begins to weep. She falls to her knees, and she's weeping on his feet, at his feet, the tears falling on his feet, and she lets down her hair, a scandalous thing to do for anyone, for any woman in the context, in a setting with so many men. And she begins in the first century, and so she begins to wipe his feet with her hair. And then she opens up her precious oil and pours it on his feet. Now, you can imagine Simon the Pharisee is mortified. I mean, what if these people think that he knows this prostitute? What kind of man is he that he would allow her to be in there? And Pharisees really had this sense of to be holy is to separate yourself from sin. And so this woman is barged into his party. He's mortified, undoubtedly angry and embarrassed. And then Jesus responds to the woman. It's a great story. I hope you read it in Luke chapter 7, verse 36 and following. But I see us, and I think Jesus intends, and Luke certainly intends, for us to see ourselves in each part of this story. We are the prostitute at times. We are Simon the Pharisee at times. And we're all called to be Jesus for other people. So when we think of the woman, she is caught in a trap of prostitution. Now, in the first century, just like today, no little girl grew up thinking, I hope to be a prostitute someday. How did you become a prostitute in the first century? Well, not very dissimilar from today. It was through financial crisis mostly. So you sold yourself into prostitution. You actually became a slave. Most historians believe most of the prostitutes in the Roman Empire were slaves. And that happened either because your parents were in financial distress and they sold their children into slavery to satisfy their own debts. Can you imagine a little girl being sold into slavery by her parents to satisfy their debts, and she becomes a prostitute? Or sometimes a woman having lost her father and maybe any male figures who could have provided support. In the first century, the males provided most of the economic resources. And so this woman finds herself with nothing else, nothing she can do. In an act of desperation, she sells herself into slavery. And so for whatever the reason, she finds herself in this place. And this is not so dissimilar from today with human trafficking, and we realize that people find themselves in distressing situations. They've often either been sold by parents in developing countries, or people find themselves fleeing home and finding a boyfriend who is supposed to love them and care for them and ends up pressing them into a life of prostitution. This is common today as well. So here's the woman, and somewhere earlier in that day, there must have been a conversation with Jesus that we don't see in the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus had to have looked at her, and this is what I imagine him saying: daughter, God loves you. You matter to God. Your life has meaning to God. You are valued and precious in his sight, and he is able to wash you clean and make you new. You can be new. He wants you to be new. This was not his will for your life. He loves you and is willing to make you new, to forgive you and to make you new. For the first time, she met a man who looked at her and who loved her, who saw who she was and saw what she could be, and offered her the grace of God and a new life and a fresh start. That evening she comes, and out of gratitude and love, she weeps at Jesus' feet, and she anoints his feet with her oil. Now, this woman represents all of us. I just remind you the word sinner, and that's what she's known as in this text, as a sinner. The word sinner means to stray, one who strays from the mark or misses the mark. And every one of us has missed the mark. There's this path we're meant to walk on. Every day we miss it. We talk about people we shouldn't talk about. We gossip, we backbite, we find ourselves angry or irritated or agitated, or we think things we shouldn't think or do things we shouldn't do. And sometimes we fail to do the things that we should do. We find ourselves caught in the trap of sin. Some of us don't realize that we've been caught in the trap of sin. We don't even recognize the fact that we're broken. So that takes us to Simon. So Simon the Pharisee is watching this woman weeping at Jesus' feet, and he's irritated, and he begins to think to himself, if this man knew who this woman was, well, he wouldn't let her touch him like she is. And it was at this moment that Jesus turns to the man, and he asks this question: Jesus says to Simon, Simon, do you see this woman? It's a great question. See, all Simon could see was the prostitute, the village prostitute. Jesus saw the woman. Do you see this woman? He couldn't see her. And all he could see was what she was. And then in the process of doing that, Simon's judging her, looking down upon her. And this is interesting. This is a tendency that we have as religious people, as we have a tendency to begin to judge other people. And so in this story, the appropriate response might be not, I'm going to love you even though you're a sinner, but I'm going to love you despite the fact that I'm a sinner. And that's what Jesus demonstrates, and that's what Simon missed. And I just remind you, when we look at these figures, we're sometimes the prostitute, but we're often Simon. In the 7 deadly sins, they're categorized and they're listed in order of severity. The least deadly of the 7 deadly sins is lust. The most deadly of the 7 deadly sins has always been listed by the church as pride. Sometimes I'm Simon. Sometimes I'm the prostitute. And so we're called then to be able to welcome and to love and to see with mercy and compassion through the eyes of Jesus the people who are around us. And that leads finally to Jesus, who offers her forgiveness and grace. And he calls us to be the kind of people who love and welcome sinners, who love and welcome people and embrace them with Christ's love.